Chapter 10. Military Commanders of the Vietnam War. The following brief biographies of major military commanders concentrate on their actions during the Vietnam War. Vong Vinh Giap Bay 1912 An Sa, Vietnam. French Indochina. Vong Vinh Giap was a Vietnamese military and political leader whose perfection of guerrilla, as well as conventional strategy and tactics, led to the Viet Minh victory over the French and to the end of French colonialism in Southeast Asia, and later to the North Vietnamese victory over South Vietnam and the United States. The son of an ardent anti-colonialist scholar, Giap as a youth began to work for Vietnamese autonomy. He attended the same high school as Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader. And while still a student in 1926, he joined the Tan Viet Cach Minh Dang, the Revolutionary Party of Young Vietnam. In 1930, as a supporter of student strikes, he was arrested by the French Charité and sentenced to 3 years in prison, but he was paroled after serving only a few months. He studied at the Lycée Albert Sarraut in Hanoi, where in 1937 he received a law degree. Giap then became a professor of history at the Lycée Thanh Long in Hanoi, where he converted many of his fellow teachers and students to his political views. In 1938, he married Minh Thai, and together they worked for the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. When in 1939 the party was prohibited, Giap escaped to China, but his wife and sister-in-law were captured by the French police. His sister-in-law was guillotined. His wife received a life sentence and died in prison after 3 years. In 1941, Giap formed an alliance with Chu Van Tan, guerrilla leader of a minority tribal group of northeastern Vietnam. Giap hoped to build an army that would drive out the French and support the goals of the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh. Giap marched his forces into Hanoi in August 1945, and in September Ho announced the independence of Vietnam. With Giap in command of all police and internal security forces and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Giap sanctioned the execution of many non-communist nationalists, and he censored nationalist newspa purged to conform to Communist Party directives. In the French Indochina War, Giap's brilliance as a military strategist and tactician led to his winning the decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu on May 7, 1954, which brought the French colonialist regime to an end. On the division of the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of North Vietnam. He subsequently led the military forces of the North to eventual victory in the Vietnam War, compelling the Americans to leave the country in 1973 and bring ing about the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, from 1976, when the two Vietnams were reunited, to 1980, Giap served as Vietnam's Minister of National Defense. He also became a Deputy Prime Minister in 1976. He was a full member of the Politburo of the Vietnamese Communist Party until 1982. Van Tan Dung, B. May 1, 1917, Co Nu, Vietnam, French Indochina, D. March 17, 2002. Hanoi. Van Tien Dung was one of North Vietnam's greatest war heroes, a peasant soldier who rose to become commander-in-chief of the North Vietnamese army and lead the final Ho Chi Minh campaign that captured and occupied Saigon, South Vietnam, in 1975. As a young man, Dung was arrested by French colonial authorities for his Communist Party activities, but he escaped from prison and in 1947 joined Giap's high command staff. Despite his lack of military training and limited battlefield experience, Dung proved to be an able logistic planner. He was named Chief of Staff of the People's Army of Vietnam in 1953 and succeeded Giap as Commander-in-Chief in 1975. After the reunification of Vietnam, he served 1980 to 87 as Defense Minister. Tierra en Ventra. Born in 1918, Quang Nai Province, Vietnam, French Indochina, D. April 20th, 1996, Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, Viet. Tran Van Tra proved to be an able man during the Vietnam War by leading communist raids on Saigon both during the Tet Offensive of 1968 and during the city's capture in 1975. Raised in southern Vietnam, he began his military career in the late 1930s fight against the French in the Viet Minh resistance movement. Following the Geneva Accords of 1954 that partitioned the country, he assumed various posts in the North Vietnamese Army. In 1963, he was sent back to the south, where he led Viet Cong guerrillas against U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Although he scored many battlefield victories and was appointed military head of the underground communist government in South Vietnam, he often clashed with party lead heirs over wartime strategy. He returned briefly to Hanoi in the mid-1970s to help plan the final assault on Saigon, in which he was the frontline commander. Dismayed at the lack of official credit he and other generals from South Vietnam received following the war, he wrote a personal account of the conflict, which was censored upon its publication in 1982. Despite falling from favor in Hanoi, Tra retained his influence among former Army officials, with whom in 1987 he organized a War Veterans Association. The group was vocal in its opposition to government policies and was banned in 1990. William Westmoreland, B. March 26, 1914. Spartanburg County, SC, U.S., D. July 18, 2005. Charleston, South Carolina. William Westmoreland commanded U.S. forces in the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1968, a period during which American involvement increased from several thousand troops to more than 500,000. Westmoreland served in the Korean War and in 1955 was promoted to Major General, becoming at age 42 the youngest man to have achieved that rank in the U.S. Army. Westmoreland became a full general in 1964. In Vietnam, he implemented a strategy of attrition, using overwhelming firepower to try to kill enemy troops at a rate faster than they could be replaced. Though he employed search and destroy tactics, massive aerial bombing campaigns, napalm, and the defoliant agent. General William C. Westmoreland, Wright, inspects a 9th Infantry Division's Mekong Delta base camp near Long Ton, Vietnam, 1966. Holton Archive/Getty Images. Orange, all to devastating effect. The Communist forces of North Vietnam and their Viet Cong allies in South Vietnam remained determined to unite their country under communist rule. Senior officials in Johnson's administration and a growing number of ordinary citizens began to see the war as unwinnable, and Westmoreland was recalled to Washington and given the post of Army Chief of Staff. He retired in 1972. Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., B. September 14, 1914, Springfield, Massachusetts, U.S., D. September 4, 1974, Washington, D.C. Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr. was commander 1968 to 72 of all U.S. forces in Vietnam during the latter stages of the Vietnam War. In April 1967, Abrams, by then a 4-star general and vice chief of staff of the Army, was named deputy to Westmoreland, who was at that time the head of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. On July 2, 1968, after Westmoreland was appointed Army Chief of Staff, Abrams succeeded him as top commander of all U.S. forces in the Vietnam theater. In this position, he implemented Nixon's Vietnamization policy, overseeing a reduction of U.S. combat troops from more than 500,000 to fewer than 30,000, and also directing an intensive training program for the Army of South Vietnam. He was in charge of the U.S. South Vietnamese incursion into Cambodia in 1970. In 1972, he was appointed Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C., where he implemented the transition to an all-volunteer force. He died of cancer while in office and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia. The U.S. Army's main battle tank, the M1 Abrams, is named in his honor. Chapter 11. Journalists and anti-war activists of the Vietnam War. Number of American journalists and anti-war activists had a noticeable effect on the perception of the war by the American public. The following brief biographies of some of these individuals concentrate on their activities during the Vietnam War. David Halberstam, B. April 10, 1934, New York, New York, U.S.D. April 23, 2007, Menlo Park, California. David Halberstam received a Pulitzer Prize in 1964 for his penetrating coverage of the Vietnam War as a staff reporter, 1960-67, for the New York Times. After earning a bachelor's degree in journalism from Harvard University, 1955, Halberstam worked as a reporter for the Daily Times Leader in West Point, Mississippi, and for the Nashville Tennessean, now the Tennessean, before joining the New York Times. While his reporting on Vietnam initially supported U.S. involvement there, The Making of a Quagmire, 1965, reflected a growing disillusionment with the war, and its title became a byword for intractable military operations. Halberstam's examination of power resulted in 3 volumes that were viewed loosely as a trilogy. The Best and the Brightest, 1972, chronicled the military failings of the United States during the Vietnam War. The Powers That Be, 1979, reviewed the impact that the media had on history, and The Reckoning, 1986, scrutinized the auto industry. Walter Cronkite, B. November 4, 1916, St. Joseph, Missouri, USD. July 17, 2009, New York, New York. Walter Cronkite was an American juror, nihilist, and pioneer of television news programming. He was a longtime anchor of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, 1962-81, for which he reported on many of the most historic events of the latter half of the 20th century. In 1962, Cronkite attained the position he would become most famous for, anchorman of the CBS Evening News. Soon after, Cronkite took over from his predecessor, Douglas Edwards. The then 15-minute broadcast was expanded to 30 minutes, making it the first half-hour nightly news show on American network television. From the anchor chair of the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, he reported on the most traumatic and triumphant moments of American life in the 1960s, from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 to the Apollo moon landing in 1969. The influence of Cronkite's reporting is perhaps best illustrated by his commentary on the Vietnam War. In 1968, he left the anchor desk to report from Vietnam on the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Upon his return, Cronkite departed from his usual objectivity, declaring that the war could end only in a protracted stalemate. President Lyndon B. Johnson told his staff, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." and some held that Johnson's decision not to run for re-election that year was a direct result of Cronkite's reporting. 190, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. People, politics, and power. Cronkite continued in his position at CBS through the 1970s, reporting on the decade's most memorable events, including the Watergate scandal, the resignation of President Richard Nixon, and the historic peace negotiations between Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. His avuncular mien and adhere to journalistic integrity, exemplified by his sign-off line, and that's the way it is, endeared him to the American pub, Lick, and a 1973 poll named him the most trusted man in America. After a long illness, Cronkite died at the age of 92 at his home in New York City. Joan Baez, B. January 9th, 1941. Staten Island, New York, U.S. Joan Baez was an American folk singer and political activist who interested young audiences in folk music during the 1960s. Despite the inevitable fading of the folk music revival, Baez continued to be a popular performer into the 21st century. By touring with younger performers throughout the world and staying politically engaged, she reached a new audience both in the United States and abroad. Her sense of commitment and unmistakable voice continued to win acclaim. An active participant in the 1960s protest movement, Baez made free concert appearances for UNESCO, civil rights organizations, and anti-Vietnam War rallies. In 1964, she refused to pay federal taxes that went toward war expenses, and she was jailed twice in 1967. The following year, she married David Harris, a leader in the national movement to oppose the draft who served nearly 2 years in prison for refusing to comply with his draft summons. They divorced in 1973. Baez was in Hanoi in December 1972, delivering Christmas presents and mail to American prisoners of war, when the United States targeted the North Vietnamese capital with the most intense bombing campaign of the war. The title track of her 1973 album, Where Are You Now, My Son?, chronicled the experience. It was a 23-minute spoken word piece, punctuated with sound clips that Baez had recorded during the bomb, and throughout the years, she remained deeply committed to social and political causes, lending her voice to many concerts for a variety of causes. Jane Fonda, B. December 21st, 1937, New York, U.S. Jane Fonda was an American motion picture actress also noted for her political activism. In the 1970s and 1980s, Fonda was active on behalf of left-wing political causes. She was an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War who journeyed to Hanoi in 1972 to denounce the U.S. bombing campaigns there. During that trip, she visited with the crew of North Vietnamese Air Defense Battery, and photographs of Fonda in the seat of an anti-aircraft gun were widely circulated. Her actions led to Fonda's being branded Hanoi Jane, recalling World War II's Tokyo Rose. In 1988, she apologized to American veterans of the Vietnam War in a televised interview with Barbara Walters, saying that some of her behavior in Hanoi was thoughtless and careless. Abby Hoffman, B. November 30th, 1936, Worcester, Massachusetts, U.S. D. April 12th, 1989, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Abby Hoffman was an American political activist and founder of the Youth International Party, Yippies. Hoffman was active in the American Civil Rights Movement before turning his energies to protesting the Vietnam War and the American economic and political system. His acts of protest blurred the line between political action and guerrilla theater, and they utilized absurdist humor to great effect. In August 1967, Hoffman and a dozen Confederates disrupted operations of the New York Stock Exchange by showering the trading floor with dollar bills. In October of that year, he led a crowd of more than 50,000 anti-war protesters in an attempt to levitate the Pentagon and exorcise the evil spirits that he claimed resided within. Hoffman's ethic was codified with the formal organization of the Yippies in January 1968. Later that year, Hoffman secured his place as a countercultural icon when he joined thousands of protesters outside the Democratic Party's national convention in Chicago. Before the demonstrations degenerated into a street battle between police and protesters, Hoffman and Yippie co-founder Jerry Rubin unveiled Pegasus, a boar hog that would serve as the Yippies' presidential candidate in 1968. These exploits, among others, led to Hoffman's being named a defendant in the so-called Chicago 7 trial, 1969, in which he was convicted of crossing state lines with intent to riot at the Democratic convention. The convict tie-in was later overturned.